All right. We have another weekly Village Torah session. We're talking about this week's parsha, which is Lech Lecha, which literally translates, which sounds very similar. It's like a doubling Lech Lecha, go, go. It's actually go for yourself. And this is really, actually, no, I'm just going to quickly bring it up on screen, but I don't want to keep it on screen, which is at the very beginning of the 12th chapter of Genesis. We have God saying to Avram, even though we want to say his name is Avraham, his name actually gets changed, but it hasn't yet been changed. So it's pre-name change, and he is Avram. And God says to Avram, Lech Lecha, sounds like two, again, same, it seems like a doubling of the same word, but it's actually go for yourself from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'm just going to do a little bit more, and then I want to come off of the text, which is, and then I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name bigger, and you will be a blessing. I will bless all those who bless you, and curse all those who will curse you, and through you all the families of the land will be blessed. So, and then Avram goes and does that, takes the family, Sarai, Lot, all that good stuff. Okay, so it's an interesting piece, and Avram does not start in, actually I'm going to go back to that. He does not actually start in Israel. In the previous chapter, we see that they had actually been somewhere else. At the very end of chapter 11, actually, we see that Terach took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, his daughter-in-law Sarai, They left from Ur of the Chaldeans. So they had actually started their journey, called Ur Kasdim in Hebrew. So that's where they had been. They were God tells them at the beginning of the 12th chapter, you need to leave from your father's house, from the land all these things that you know, and they had been in Ur, right? That was the native land, and Ur Kasdim. So I actually want to do something that I've not done before in this series. I'm going to do something totally different for me. It's not my normal style, but it's worth experimenting and seeing how well this plays with people, which is talking about Midrash. So just as a quick little introduction to Midrash. So Midrash it kind of comes from Darash, which is expounding, although oftentimes Midrash is a narrative expansion. These are, and I would say traditionally Midrash, or in plural Midrashim. Midrashim are typically it was a style done by the rabbis of the first 5, 6, ultimately I think 6 centuries, although it continued, that kept going easily until the 12th century of the Common Era. But the bulk of them were created in the first 5 centuries of the Common Era. And the really fascinating thing we find about Midrashim is there were actually some Midrashim that preceded the rabbis, that come from the Second Temple Era, and we can find in the 2nd and 1st centuries of the Common Era, probably even in the 3rd century before the Common Era, they were like pre-rabbinic Midrashim. They are narrative expansions, meaning they take stuff from the biblical text and they make them bigger. They say, what happened between happening and this happening? Maybe such and such happened. So I want to use this this week's session to talk about some rabbinic midrashim, some narrative expansions, and what they do with Avram is really fascinating. So, and Deb, have you come across midrashim in the past?
No, I have not.
Okay, so then this will be new for you too. So midrashim. So I want to share some midrashim about Avram that the rabbis came up with. So the first is, there's this really fascinating idea that he came from Ur Kasdim. Ur sounds a lot like or, which is light, or it could almost be like to some degree, like a fiery sort of place. And there's one is that the rabbis understood. Okay, so one is that that Avram had experienced an ordeal similar to a much later biblical character that we see in the book of Daniel, that he had been thrown into a fire, that somehow, what's his name? Nimrod. That Avram had somehow chanced upon Nimrod, and Nimrod was somehow threatened, and so Nimrod tossed Avram into a fire, into a fiery furnace, and somehow Avram had escaped, and that this was somehow proof of his belief and that God had protected him, and that this had helped, I don't know, bring Abraham into, I don't know, some more of a God belief thing, which is an interesting story. Actually, there's a really fascinating pre-rabbinic midrash. This is from, I want to say, the 2nd century before the Common Era, that had actually connected the building of the Tower of Babel. So this was from last week's Torah portion, that Abraham was somehow involved, saw what was going on, and while they were using furnaces to make bricks to make the Tower of Babel, that Abraham had somehow encountered this Nimrod character who had some sort of, I don't know, maybe he was a king or a warlord or something, and Abraham did something to upset Nimrod, and Nimrod tossed Abraham into this fiery furnace, and Abraham then escaped, and all was well with Avram. It's some interesting stuff. I'm not a big fan of those, but I mean, I like them. I think they're cute. I think they do a nice connection. But one of the things that the rabbis were curious about is why Avram. The very beginning of this week's Torah portion, why Avram? All we see really, we see the end of chapter 11 about Avram. We don't really see much, and then ultimately, Haran died, and Terach's father and Avram and Nahor took wives. We don't really see much about Avram. He just happens to be just like everybody else. He was one of the begats, right? Bunch of names, bunch of people, lived a bunch of years. Avram really is nothing special up until we get to the beginning of our week, our Torah portion of this week, which is God speaks to him and says, go, get out of here. Go to this land I'm going to show you. And this is what has the rabbis baffled and deeply curious. What makes Avram different or special? Why should he get this divine command? There are different answers to this. As you can imagine, rabbis have different ideas about things. One is that there's one model, which is interesting, which is that Avram was actually really not that special as a recipient, meaning it was almost as if God had been making like a radio broadcast, like God had an antenna, and out from this antenna had been broadcasting to everybody in the world, Lech Lecha me'eretzcha, all these things. Go forth from this land and go to the land I will show you. That this was just a constant broadcast, almost like a Mayday or an SOS signal that had been broadcast, and one person picks it up, right? Like an SOS signal. You just happen to have a ship that crosses by, hears it on the broadcast, and goes and saves this person from this deserted island. Here too, Avram is somehow, for whichever reasons, was receptive to the message, was able to plug into the frequency and listen to God's command, and he hearkens to it and picks himself and his family up, and they leave. Which is an interesting model. Then, of course, what makes Avram more receptive to this message than others? So that's already an interesting, sort of like what makes Avram special is that he is able to give ear. He is able to be receiving this broadcasting message, right? So it's not necessarily directed to Avram. It's that he was the only one who was able to receive it and or otherwise understands this divine mission of a message, which is an interesting model of, it's more of Avram was receptive. A different model is that Avram was actually special in some shape or form. One really fascinating midrash was that Avram's father was an idol maker. So, and that Avram through his, I think he recognized something intellectually, that idolatry, idol worship was not effective. It did not make sense. That's not the way the world works in Avram's mind. And that as a child, according to this midrash, that as a child living and growing up in his father's workshop as an idol crafter, as an idol maker, that his father leaves one day, goes out, I don't know, maybe he has an errand, maybe he goes out to the marketplace, who knows. While his father is gone, Avram smashes all the idols, destroys all of them, every single one of them, except for one. He leaves one remaining, and what does he leave? He leaves the biggest idol in the workshop, in his father's, his father's idol making workshop. His father comes back, and as any small business owner who makes artisan,
He's mad.
who sees every
Mad.
Yes, he's really mad. He sees all of them smashed but one, right? It might as well be all of them. He is furious. He is upset. He is livid. What does Avram respond to him? He says, oh, you know what? They are so powerful. They all fought each other. They're so powerful. They all fought each other, and the biggest of them survived. He defeated all of them, which is
how funny.
Yeah, it is a funny one. It
is funny.
For sure. What Avram, as a child here in this rabbinic midrash, is trying to show his father is that you really think these are efficacious? You really think these are effective or powerful or can exert power over the world? They can't even exert power over anything in this room, right? Avram's telling his father, you think this is worthwhile? They can't do anything. And if you do believe that they can do something, they can destroy themselves. I don't know if he got punished according to that rabbinic midrash, but so it was almost like and the way that rabbinic midrash is positioned, it shows Avram as a child, right? Ultimately, I want to say, I didn't do the calculations, but by the time, according to everybody's years and ages, that this happens in the beginning of our Torah portion in chapter 12, he's already an adult. So this is many years later. So it could be something that, according to the rabbis, that beginning as a child, he realizes, he begins to cultivate a sense of an acknowledgement of the divine, of God, and that seeing everybody else around him being idol worshipers, Abraham was different and distinct in that he was monotheistic. He believed in one God. And
that's why he packed his family up, left.
Yeah.
Right?
He was receptive. I mean, yeah, he packed himself up because he not only believed in God, cultivated a sense of the divine, and ultimately then he listened to God when he finally got this command, this charge to depart from this land and to go to wherever God's showing him to go. Yeah. So
makes total sense.
What?
It makes total sense.
Yeah. And so
why he would leave.
What?
It makes total sense why he would leave.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there could have also been something very idolatrous about where he had been living, and there would be a better place for him to go as far as having, living a more godly existence, I guess. Ultimately,
well, and if you were a family, like the head of your family, you don't want your children to develop a religion that is contrary to yours.
Yeah.
Correct?
Right.
So you take them and you put them.
Right. And that's one of the interesting things. Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that ultimately happens is that Avram doesn't ever settle in a place where there's a bunch of people. He encounters different people along the way, different kings, but he never really joins in a town or other settlement really amongst other people, perhaps because of what you were mentioning is the character and also the culture around him. He really wanted to get away from that. And that could be part of that divine command that we see at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, which is get away from everybody. It's a maybe a negative culture. It's definitely not something that's really where people should be at culturally. And so he needed to get out. It's also interesting you talk about kids. So the beginning of chapter 16, so we have Avram's wife Sarai had no children, but she did have a maidservant named Hagar. And so Sarai says, you know what? Maybe you should have a child with my maidservant. So he complies, and ultimately he does have a child, Yishmael, and Sarai's not happy. But then ultimately, beginning of chapter 17, God appears to Avram, says, I'm El Shaddai, walk my way, da, 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 da. And then here's the name change. You're no longer going to be called Avram, but it's actually going to be Avraham, for I shall make you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fertile and make nations of you, and kings shall come forth for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which is fascinating because he's only had one child at this point. He had Yishmael through Hagar, and that was it. His wife was barren. And ultimately, we see there's Brit Milah ultimately, but ultimately Sarah, who was Sarai, now her name is Sarah, she will give birth. Now it's of course funny, she laughs, and because she's super duper old, she's like, I'm not fertile anymore, I'm pretty old. But ultimately she's successful, and then they have Brit Milah. But there is ultimately children born from him, and I think that's also what makes it really fascinating as far as his thinking about bringing up culturally children in what type of environment. And I'm also I'm gonna sneak into next week's Torah portion. I'm just gonna go ahead and do it. So this is a sneak preview into next week's Torah portion, which is by Vayera in chapter 18, which is God visited Avram while he was out in the terebinths of Mamre. But there are a bunch of trees, and a few people come by, and he's a hospitable host. And what's really fascinating in chapter 18 is Avram as being a hospitable host. This really emphasizes how really not part of any other settlement he is. He really has separated himself culturally, and it's just not an appropriate or particularly moral cultures around him. So he sets himself apart. He's out in the middle of nowhere. At the same time, he is still a hospitable host to people, as we see. There's a sneak preview to next week's Torah portion of chapter 18, where he's a hospitable host to these few guys who are stopping by. And even though whether they're angels or people is another story, that's a whole other ball of wax, which I'm not getting into at the moment. But he still, this seems to be part of his morality and part of the culture he's trying to bring forth, which is being a good person. And this is in direct contrast to what we see later in next week's Torah portion. I know I'm getting ahead, but it's connected to what Avram's doing, which is ultimately where Lot, his nephew, has settled in Stone. They are not particularly moral. They are not leading a good life culturally, and they have it's really bad. And ultimately, spoiler alert, in next week's Torah portion of Vayera is that 5 towns get destroyed because they don't even have 10 righteous people within them. And even though Avram pleads on their behalf, ultimately they are not living a good lifestyle, a good moral lifestyle, and only, again, spoiler, Lot and his daughters make it out. And so there's something to be said that Avram really was what we see from the beginning of this week's Torah portion in chapter 12, that God was sending Avram out to lead a moral lifestyle and not to be caught up in the misguided cultural, bad stuff, for lack of a better term.
Cultural norms of the day.
Yeah, that they were, right. and I suspect it has more, and not just simply because they were idolatrous and he believed in God, in a singular God. I think there were other things as well. I think what he does at the beginning of next week's Torah portion, as far as being a hospitable host to these travelers on their way, I think is a good sign versus what we see later on in next week's Torah portion of the way that the people of Sodom treat Lot, who is even living within their midst, and that the people of Sodom are inhospitable, and they are not being friendly with the guests, which I think at this point there were 3 who visited Avram, and I think there were only 2 left by the time that they reached Sodom, and that they were not being hospitable. And I think that's a direct contrast. Again, I know I'm getting into next week's Torah portion, but there's a direct contrast between the culture of Avram, who's trying to lead a good and godly life, whereas the inhabitants of Sodom are being almost mean to any wayfarers, any travelers, any guests, and that's ultimately what leads to their destruction in next week's Torah portion.
Well, now is Stone a community or is it a community or family?
It's a town. It's like a town or a small city. And ultimately what happens in next week's Torah portion, Stone, so that there's I think 5, but they usually are just called Sodom and Amorah, or Sodom, or in English we would say Sodom and Gomorrah. And there were a handful of them that ultimately next week get destroyed by God.
Now, what is the name of Abraham's community?
He doesn't. I mean, that's one of the really interesting things. He doesn't have a community. He's out by himself. He has I want to say a right-hand man named Eliezer, and Sarah has Hagar as her handmaid, and Avram has Yishmael out of Hagar, and ultimately Isaac out of Sarah. But it seems to be that he's off on his own, that he really took this divine directive at the very beginning of our Torah portion is he's really out by himself. He's not part of any other community, and probably because of the lack of proper civility and morality.
All right, now the child he has with the handmaid, what is his name?
Ishmael, or Ishmael.
Okay, and then the one he has with Sarah is called
Isaac, or Yitzchak in Hebrew.
Isaac,
and then
now Isaac, isn't he the one that has isn't that line considered a pure line in heritage? And Ishmael or whatever, it's not.
I don't know what you mean as far as pure. I mean, both
He's the bloodline.
Both
Sarah.
Both Ishmael and Isaac are both the offspring of Abraham, and ultimately what I think it's at the end of next week's Torah portion. It could be, I don't remember which Torah portion it is, but ultimately after Avram dies, both of them come to bury their father. It's really Sarah, even though she asks Abraham to sire a child through her handmaid Hagar, ultimately after it happens, she has jealousy. She's not happy about the situation. She changes her tune and she says, "Get them out of my house." And so he has to send them off. So Hagar and Ishmael go their own way. And but what's really fascinating, and then I want to say this because it's going to relate back to what I mentioned about Avram's name change from Avram to Avraham, because he's going to be Avhamon Goyim. He's going to be a father of many nations, which is that between Isaac and Ishmael, he does, because Isaac then has Jacob, and then Jacob ultimately has Jacob and Esau. So Esau has a bunch of offspring, and they ultimately have a bunch of nations. But of course, Jacob then gives birth to the 12, ultimately the different tribes that we see. He's sort of the Jewish line, right? Through Abraham comes Isaac. After Isaac is Jacob, and then Jacob that really is the children of Israel. But even on Ishmael's side, Ishmael, even according to, he's the father of all the Arab nations. And that's what we see, that the Arabs understand themselves also. They are the children of Ishmael. and also, ultimately Islam, right? So,
Right.
yeah. So
That's where it comes.
yeah, and so one of the interesting things is that you mentioned earlier the children, and at the time he didn't have any children, but he not only has children, but his children then really populate the world greatly, and there are lots of nations that spring forth from him, whether the Arab nations, the Jewish, you have children of Esau, so there's a lot that ultimately emerge.
Okay, now, is Islam a monolithic religion?
Yeah, they are a monotheistic religion. Yes.
They're okay. All right.
Yeah, so
Then
it's interesting because there are different.
why-
Yeah. So both the children of Avraham. So Avram really is he's a trailblazer, so to speak, as being a monotheistic believer, and both of his children, Isaac and Ishmael, both go off, and they also carry the monotheistic message, because Ishmael ultimately, through the descendants of Ishmael, create Islam, which is a monotheistic religion, and ultimately through Isaac you get to Jacob, and the children of Jacob are eventually the Jewish nation. So they're also monotheistic.
then why did the Jews fight the Arabs?
For various political reasons concerning Israel. It's really around Israel. It's a lot more than just that. I mean, there's a lot of the fighting has really been in the last century, and a lot of that has been centered around Israel, which is a whole other ball of wax. It's a whole other conversation.
I don't understand. Okay, then we need to have, I don't understand if they're both from the same father, different mothers, but the same father, they both founded a monistic religion. Why in the world do they constantly fight? Because it's the same God, right?
It's the same God, but if we want to go to the 20th and 21st century, they're competing over the land of Israel and political power. It's
over the land itself, the ground.
Yeah, and there's some religious components to that, to be sure, but it's like a religious and political thing. They're not, yeah, it's complicated.
Well, what is so religious about the ground?
So I'm going to quickly say something, but it's not fully going to do it justice, which is that the Jews believe that Israel is their homeland, right? It's the promised land. They only have one, and they should have access, if not ownership, over the land of Israel as their homeland. Whereas the Muslims, they don't believe in that, and so I'm not an expert in Islam and more Muslim thought. I think I don't know. I think there's issues of political control and stuff like that, but that's definitely beyond my scope of knowledge.
Well,
To them.
doesn't Islam encounter a large geographical area?
Yeah, there are many Muslim countries throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and then there's also a country with the most Muslims in the world, which is in neither, which is Malaysia, which has the most Muslims in the world. So that's a whole other geopolitical ball of wax that I am not touching, because I am not an expert in this. Joining us, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you for having.
A little bit of an overview of what's going on with Avram, as well as a little bit of an introduction to Midrash and Midrashim, which, who knows, maybe we'll continue exploring and throwing into this this Torah portion series. So
Now,
yeah.
a midrash Give me the definition of a midrash, please.
A rabbinic narrative expansion.
Okay. That is not necessarily true, right?
It's, I don't know what you mean by true. It could be religiously true. It could be literarily true. It doesn't necessarily have to be historically true. Doesn't necessarily mean that these happened ever, but it's certainly midrashim. Maybe we could do a separate discussion about midrashim, but ultimately, it's oftentimes. I'll say this. Oftentimes, what the rabbis talk about the midrashim, they're curious of what's not being said in the text, or maybe if a text says something in a weird way, they say this feels weird, and they need to talk about it a little bit more, because there's certainly material for them to talk about, whether it's the character of a particular person. And in our instance, it was Avram, but in next week's Torah portion, there's some interesting midrashim about his nephew Lot. And what we see is that they're curious, because if these are people, we only see glimpses of them, what else are their lives about? And they really start to fill in sort of the gaps about these people.
Well, what the midrash is then is the rabbis' conversations.
Yes.
Right.
They're rabbinic conversations, but they could be about anything. But in these, in the way we're talking about them, they're narrative expansions. They're expanding upon the stories as we have them.
Gotcha.
Yep.
That's fine.
So yeah, maybe I'll incorporate some more as we go, as the weeks go.
That'd be great. I enjoy it. That makes sense. It makes it come alive.
All right.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. And I'll look forward to all those things you're sending me.
Absolutely. All right. Well,
thank you. Have a great day.
All right, everybody. And Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye. Shabbat Shalom to you.